Hey everybody, Rob Nelson, Roundtable, here with Alex Zaitchik, who is our editor-in-chief of Roundtable COVID Investigates. Alex, thanks for joining me. Alex, you have a great story out right now about drug trials. And the top line on this is that a subcontractor for Pfizer in their trials for the COVID vaccine was accused by a whistleblower of some serious malfeasance. I mean, not necessarily intentionally, but just mismanagement, bad data reporting, all kinds of like big no-nos. And that's the breaking story. There's a story under that, but let's start with that.
Yeah, the BMJ, formerly the British Medical Journal, came out with a story just the other day about, based on documents provided by a whistleblower named Brooke Jackson, and they demonstrate an incredible amount of just sloppy behavior and lack of oversight during one of the most critical trials in recent memories, which is, the human stage 3 trial of the coronavirus.
So before we talk about stage 3 trials in general, specifically, what was the subcontractor accused of doing or not doing? And why does it matter?
There was false entry of data. There was accidental unblinding of participants. The whole point of a double-blind trial is you don't know who's getting the placebo versus who's getting the vaccine, and that information was not strictly maintained so that administrators of the trial knew who was getting what, which is a big no-no. And
that's a huge. I'm gonna stop you. That's huge. The whole point of a double-blind trial, if you take away the blind,
undermines the credibility of a phase 3 trial of this nature. Absolutely.
And misreporting data or messing up data. I mean, those are the two things, right, that you peg it on. Your data is accurate, and it's a double-blind trial. That's why we want that, and it's supposedly so significant. So once you do that, it really does question how accurate was any of it.
So she kicked all of this up the chain. This manager, Brooke Jackson, who was an experienced clinical trial manager, and no action was taken. And she contacted the FDA, and it turns out that the executives of this subcontractor, Ventavia, knew about the problems before she even was hired in September of 2020, and they didn't really fix the problems. They had meetings set up with employees to talk about the importance of falsifying data and entering information correctly, but it's not clear that it was really handled ever, and the FDA does not appear to have investigated the matter.
Well, now that's a separate issue, and I just want to touch on that for a second, because at the outset I was thinking, it's not clear this was intentionally trying to do something wrong. It may have just been serious negligence.
Yeah, it looks to be a case of extreme negligence.
But the FDA not investigating, right, that's a separate issue, right? Because once it's kicked up the chain, now you do know, negligent or not, intentional, unintentional, there was a serious mistake in the process that should now be looked at, and you're saying they just look the other way.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's now pretty standard practice for complaints of this nature to be ignored. Something like 1% of all clinical trials are, investigated by the FDA.
In general.
In general, yeah. The understaffing of the FDA is notoriously bad, and it's been getting worse for a long time, and it's reached crisis levels to the point where the FDA really can't do its job.
So let me take this up one level. And one of the things, and we're watching this, Alex is a really great investigative reporter. He dives into things. He goes deep. You can read his books. You can read the many numerous other places he's published, prominent, magazines, journals, and you're really thorough and thoughtful. And one of the things that caught my eye about your story was you kind of predicated on the idea that aside from this specific there's massive vaccine uncertainty going on, and there's all kinds of causes for it, but one of the common themes is people distrust the science. They're not sure. They don't know if they've seen enough data, and they distrust pharmaceuticals. One of the things And those are all legitimate questions for someone to raise. They want answers. I'm just saying those are questions people have. They want answers. One of the things that caught my eye about your article was you pointed out that there was a way to possibly have avoided that early on that the U.S. drug companies ignored, which was and I'll let you dive into it, but to do stage 3 trials. And for those who don't know, those are safety, efficacy. They're like the most important part. To do those trials in an open sourced way.
Yeah, this story is the latest of several stories that have come out of the closed trials that took place, especially overseen by Moderna and Pfizer, which were not the only option on the table. In February of 2020, the World Health Organization convened its network of infectious disease experts and public health experts dealing with pandemics in Geneva, and they came up with like an action plan. This was the meeting where they first named COVID-19 got its name, and one of the items was a global head-to-head trial system for treatments and vaccines. It was just assumed that in a pandemic situation, you want to have as many variables covered as possible with the human population. And why not take advantage of this massive network of hospitals, doctors, field sites, where you can cross-test experimental treatments, and eventually they plan to do this with vaccines. And the companies wanted nothing to do with it because, one, they would lose control of the trial data, which is part of their intellectual property portfolio and a very important part of it. And also because it may reveal their product to be lesser than a competitor. And that was more important to them than getting the fullest picture possible in the shortest amount of time of what the vaccine is.
But so to your point, I just want to highlight this. The reasons they didn't want to do that weren't because it wouldn't create a good, safe product. The WHO, for those who distrust, you see a lot of people on the right, whatever, the WHO, they hate the WHO. You're saying, we're talking, the European Union, the WHO, a universally wide group of doctors and scientists were in favor of this open form of doing phase 3 trials, as you put it, precisely because it would ensure more effective and more information, more effective, safe vaccines, and more certainty that you weren't hiding things that didn't work.
Yeah, and it also, there wouldn't have been any glitches. For example, one of the Moderna contractors famously only hired white participants for a pandemic that had affected people of color disproportionately. And they had to at least have a threshold of participants from different ethnic groups, and they didn't because it was just cheaper or easier, or they weren't that bright. Who knows? But the NIH had to step in and fix the problem. And this wouldn't have been an issue had the vaccine trials been taking place on 7 continents. You would have had every possible genetic variation covered, and then some.
And again, the reason they didn't, as you pointed out, was the U.S. pharma companies didn't want to do that because, one, it would lose their intellectual property control, and 2, it might expose weaknesses and flaws and show that somebody else's drug was better. So pure self-interest.
They didn't want to participate in the treatment trials either, but the nature of treatments are such that their participation wasn't necessary. So the WHO went ahead with those trials. And, for example, Gilead's remdesivir, the first antiviral that was touted as a possible treatment for severe COVID, was shown to not be that effective after all, which is an example of why Gilead didn't want anything to do with this trial. They had their own they had their own private contractor conduct trials, which found that, surprise, surprise, it was better than the WHO's much more thorough trials.
And you talked about that black people were excluded initially from the Moderna trial, and pregnant women as well, right? There was a whole issue on non-clean pregnant women.
It wasn't that they were excluded. They didn't come. They were 50% short of the statistical threshold at several sites in North Carolina.
Got it. So, okay, and I want to be clear, not excluded like intentionally. We don't want to put black people in, but they didn't represent them adequately given the way the disease was affecting those populations. But pregnant women were not included in a comprehensive way at all, right?
That was a huge shortcoming of the mRNA trials. Yeah.
That they were largely unincluded.
Yeah, and that's why you had pregnant women extremely hesitant to take the vaccine, because there just wasn't the data. And again, that data almost certainly would have been compiled had the global trials taken place.
So all this, and I want to come back and talk about this again with you, but I mean, this, and maybe we'll do a whole roundtable. I mean, but this to me is so interesting because so much vaccine hesitancy, well, people sometimes say it's grounded in politics or this. I've heard a lot of doctors say to me, a big part of it is grounded in legitimate questions. And if you're a pregnant woman and they don't have adequate data, you are going to be hesitant. That's normal. I mean, I've heard a lot of black people say to me, black community's been disproportionately not dealt well by the U.S. government with medical stuff. We want to see more data on how it affects black people. Like, those are legitimate things for communities to want to know before they get this. And if they don't have the data.
Yeah. Yeah, there were a lot of arguments for holding the global trials, and hopefully next time they will be held. And that's one of the subjects, it's worth mentioning, being discussed at the end of the month at a first ever World Health Assembly being held, sort of in between the normal one that happens every spring. They're holding a special session to talk about a pandemic treaty in Geneva, and that pandemic treaty may include how trials will take place with something.
Is there any doubt in your mind, last question on this, Alex, that if they had done this, and again, this global approach, I'm going to reference it almost like an open sourced approach, but you'd have more companies, more players involved, more visibility so that you could share data, share insights, and have more accountability. Had they done that recommended approach early on, by the WHO and others, is there any doubt in your mind that had they done that, we would have had more accurate, more reliable data, and possibly even better vaccines?
I mean, it's a counterfactual, but that seems to be the consensus among, international public health experts. Yeah, I mean, it was shocking that, maybe not shocking considering the industry we're talking about, but that the companies would forego that opportunity with this ready-to-go network of thousands of hospitals and field sites and medical teams around the world ready to be activated, and instead hire the incredibly amateur hour subcontractors. Is an unfortunate part.
Hey, thanks for talking about this. Look, I don't know when people are going to stop expecting large companies, whatever their industry, to act in the public interest first. They don't. They act in their private interest. It's almost not their job to be the public interest. It's our job to force them to accommodate the public interest.
And that could, it's worth mentioning, that could have been written into the Warp Speed contracts, and they weren't. There were no requirements.
Meaning we could have written that, and the U.S. government could have written that.
The U.S. government that provided Moderna, for example, with more than $1 billion, could have said, we're going to participate in these trials, and that's how it's going to be.
Right.
The U.S. government has some power over these things. All governments do. So that's
yeah, and I'm sure nobody's getting a lot of money from the pharma companies in those campaigns. I'm being facetious, but not. It's sad. But hey, look, these are great questions, great insight, Alex. This is such a great topic. I'm serious. I want to try and do a roundtable on this and kind of look at this bigger issue. It's really fascinating. Appreciate the time and the research. It's a great article.
Thank you, Rob.
I'll talk to you later.
Indeed. Take care.
You too.